The scar on my right forearm tells a story that most people don't expect. It's a soft pink now, no longer the angry red it once was. Occasionally, visitors notice it while I'm pouring tea or tending to my garden in Traverse City. They glance at it briefly, then quickly avert their eyes, assuming it's just another sign of aging. But this scar isn't a mark of carelessness or frailty. It's a reminder of the day I finally grasped my true worth, the day my 14-year-old grandson taught me the hardest, most painful lesson of my life, in more ways than one. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. I had always prided myself on being strong, self-sufficient, even. But that strength had been eroded over time, piece by piece, until it had nearly disappeared completely. It had started with the small sacrifices, the things I ignored or accepted because I didn't want to cause trouble. But eventually, I realized just how far my dignity had been stretched, until it snapped. It was supposed to be a simple arrangement. I moved in with Gregory and Pam after Frank passed away, a practical solution, or so I thought. But what began as an act of kindness quickly became something more insidious. What they had promised as a refuge soon turned into a cage. Gregory, once my pride and joy, had transformed into someone unrecognizable, a man who thought he was entitled to everything, including my savings. It started with small things. At first, I didn't notice. A little borrowing here, a minor shift in how my money was spent there. It wasn't until I started asking questions that the cracks appeared. Gregory grew defensive, his answers evasive. I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't have the strength to face it head-on, not at first. It wasn't until I was sitting in the doctor's office, watching the papers from a recent evaluation of my health, that I realized the depth of my situation. The conservatorship they had convinced me to sign, claiming it was for my safety and well-being, was nothing but a tool to control my finances, to drain me of everything I had worked for my entire life. The assets I had saved with Frank, the retirement we had built together, all of it was slipping through my fingers, funneling into their lives without my consent. The breaking point came when I filed a police report, an act that was more about reclaiming my voice than anything else. It felt like a betrayal of the family, but I knew deep down that it was the only way to make them understand that I was not the helpless, confused old woman they thought I had become. I had been silent for too long, swallowing my hurt, my anger, just to maintain the peace. That woman was gone, and she wasn't coming back. Gregory didn't see it that way. His response was one of anger and manipulation. "This isn't you," he said, his voice full of the same self-righteous indignation he had always carried. "You've made a mistake, Mom. You've turned on us. But what else could I do?" His narrative, the one where I was confused, sick, a burden to him and his family, had taken hold in our home, in our town. It wasn't just a legal issue anymore. It was about who I was, who I had allowed myself to become. The court hearing came and went. Judge Oakes, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind, saw through the lies and ordered the conservatorship dissolved. But that was just the beginning. With the conservatorship gone, I gained access to what remained of my accounts. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rebuild my independence, step by painstaking step. Through the long weeks of legal battles and sleepless nights, I began to reclaim not just my money, but my sense of self. The lake cottage I moved into became my sanctuary, a place where I could rediscover the things that had made me who I was before all of this started. Photography, writing, the simple joys of solitude and reflection, they became my daily rituals, and through them I started to heal. But healing, I soon realized, wasn't just about taking back what had been stolen. It was about facing the truth. About finding the courage to say no more, and to mean it. As the legal proceedings continued, I discovered more about my family, about the lies they had told themselves, about the excuses they had made to justify their actions. I could have let the bitterness consume me, but I chose a different path. I chose to stand firm, to hold Gregory accountable, not just for the money he had taken, but for the way he had treated me, his mother. I chose to make space for my grandchildren, especially Megan, who was starting to understand the complexity of the situation, and Tyler, who was still lost in the fog of manipulation and entitlement. What would the future hold? I couldn't say. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let this chapter of my life define me. I wasn't going to let it destroy me either. I had already lost so much, but I still had my voice. I still had the power to choose my next step. The journey was far from over, but the first step had been taken. And that was enough for now. The relief after the conservatorship was dissolved felt like a weight lifted from my shoulders. But the weight of what had been lost still hung over me, casting a shadow on every step I took. Yes, I had reclaimed some control over my finances, but the emotional toll of the past months was far more complex than a balance sheet could ever capture. Mornings at the lake cottage were quiet. I spent them photographing the world outside, capturing the delicate light of dawn as it filtered through the trees, the soft ripples on the water, the way the fog hung in the air like a promise of something new. Photography became my meditation, the lens through which I saw myself and the world around me. It reminded me that even in the smallest moments, there was beauty, something worth holding on to. But it wasn't just the physical world that demanded my attention. There was the emotional landscape to navigate, one that was much harder to capture, much harder to frame. I hadn't anticipated how painful the process of rebuilding relationships would be. Megan, the one grandchild who still reached out with love and understanding, was a source of light. Our visits were filled with walks, talks, and shared moments of silence by the lake. She was only 10, but her wisdom astounded me. She could see through the cracks of our family's facade, and I admired her for it. I wanted to shield her from the chaos, from the pain of understanding the fractures in her family. But I also wanted to show her a better way, a way forward that didn't involve denying the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. Tyler, however, was a different story. When I first saw him after the incident with the hot water, there was a moment where I didn't recognize the boy in front of me. His eyes were hard, his posture defensive. He had the same rebellious streak that Gregory carried, the belief that consequences were for other people, not for him. Yet, beneath the anger, I could still see traces of the little boy who had once been so open, so trusting. Our first meeting after everything was tense, awkward, and filled with silence. He didn't want to be there. I didn't want to force him, but I knew this was our chance to begin rebuilding the connection we once had. We played games, talked about things that once seemed trivial, like school projects and hobbies. Slowly, the walls began to crack, though Tyler's reluctance remained thick. He was still young enough to be shaped by the events that had unfolded, and yet too old to avoid responsibility. Pam, in her quiet way, had come to terms with the situation too. Her own awakening had been slower than mine, but it was no less profound. The email she sent me, filled with apology and willingness to help, had been unexpected. It felt like an olive branch, but I couldn't be sure if it was genuine or just another tactic in the web of manipulation Gregory had spun around us all. Still, she seemed to truly want to make amends, not just with me but with the children. For the first time, she acknowledged the truth of what had happened. The financial abuse, the lies, the exploitation. We had a difficult meeting in which Pam admitted her role in the whole affair. She had known, at least partially, what was going on but had chosen to look the other way. She apologized for her part in it, but it wasn't easy to forgive. Her gesture was small, but it was a step in the right direction. Gregory, on the other hand, continued to resist. His pride was too deeply entrenched for him to ever fully accept what he had done. He had rewritten the narrative, convinced himself that he had been the victim. Despite the documentation and evidence, he still couldn't bring himself to admit that he had stolen from me, that he had manipulated and lied to me for years. The court proceedings, slow as they were, continued. The forensic accounting report was the key to everything. Gregory had diverted a staggering amount of money, nearly $400,000, over the course of 2 years. He had justified it to himself, telling himself that he deserved it, that he had been taking care of me. But it was a theft, plain and simple. The hardest part of this process wasn't the legal battle. It was facing the reality that my own son had treated me this way. I wasn't sure what would come next. The restitution process was long, and the final outcome was uncertain. There was talk of repayment plans, liens on property, and garnished wages. But the financial recovery was secondary. What I wanted most, what I needed most, was to reclaim my dignity, to stand up for myself and to stop allowing my family to dictate the terms of my life. To know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had chosen to live on my own terms. One of the most surprising outcomes of all this was how the community around me began to shift. People I had once known as acquaintances, even friends, started to approach me differently. They had heard the rumors, of course, but they had also seen the way I handled myself, the quiet strength that came with standing in my truth. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a shadow of someone else's story. I felt like myself. The toughest part, however, was the ongoing relationship with my grandchildren. Megan and Tyler represented two very different paths, one filled with hope, the other clouded with confusion and anger. I didn't know how to fix it, but I knew I couldn't give up. Not on them. Not on me. Then came the unexpected. After months of resistance, Gregory's attorney contacted mine with an offer to settle. They had finally acknowledged the financial wrongdoing, though they wouldn't admit it outright. Instead, they proposed a repayment plan, a long one, stretching over several years. The terms were reasonable, and it seemed like the end was in sight. But even as I signed the papers, I knew that the real resolution wouldn't come from any legal agreement. It would come from within me. It would come from the quiet choices I made each day, from the way I chose to heal, to grow, to rebuild. This wasn't just about money, or Gregory, or even the painful family dynamics. It was about me reclaiming my power. It was about stepping into my truth and finding my way back to a life that was mine to live. Months passed since the settlement. The legal battle with Gregory and the slow process of restitution had become a distant, though ever-present, echo in my life. The worst of it was behind me, but the healing was far from over. I had reclaimed my autonomy, but there was still so much left to rebuild, both in my relationships and in my sense of self. At the lake cottage, life had settled into a new rhythm. The mornings were spent with my camera, capturing the subtle shifts in light, in nature, and in my own heart. Photography had become more than a hobby. It was a way to see the world, to reflect on its beauty and complexity. It mirrored the journey I had taken, finding clarity amid the chaos, looking for the moments of peace within the storm. My first visit to the community center after the legal proceedings ended was a turning point. It had been a place of refuge during my earlier struggles, but I had avoided it, unsure of how people would perceive me. Would they still see me as Gregory's mother, the woman at the center of the scandal? Or would they finally see me for who I had become, someone who had fought for her dignity, her rights, and her future? As I entered the center that afternoon, I was met with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. Some faces were familiar, others were new, but all of them were looking at me with a kind of respect I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized that my presence, my ability to stand tall despite everything that had happened, had changed the way people saw me. I wasn't just the victim of a son's betrayal. I was someone who had fought back, who had refused to be silenced. The first step had been reclaiming my financial independence. The second, much more challenging step, was reclaiming my place in the world. I was no longer just a mother, a grandmother, or a daughter-in-law. I was Eleanor Wilson, a woman in her own right, with a life of her own to live. The relationships with my children were still fragile, but I knew that if I could find a way to stand firm, to offer them the same grace and wisdom that I had learned to give myself, there was hope for rebuilding the pieces we had once shared. Gregory remained distant, communicating only through his lawyer regarding the settlement payments. I had long ago accepted that our relationship could never go back to what it was. What hurt the most was the way he had rejected any possibility of reconciliation, any willingness to face the truth of what he had done. But in some strange way, I had begun to feel a kind of peace with that. I couldn't force him to change, and I couldn't keep hoping that he would. The only person I could change, the only relationship I could rebuild, was with myself. Pam, too, had shifted in unexpected ways. Her newfound honesty, the courage she had found to break free from Gregory's control, had created a space for the possibility of a new kind of relationship. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many unspoken tensions, but Pam was no longer the woman who had enabled Gregory's actions. She was trying to make amends, not just with me but with herself. The truth, once hidden, had started to find its way into the cracks of her life, too. Megan continued to visit regularly, and our bond deepened. I could see her changing, growing into a young woman with the same wisdom and insight that had always been her gift. She had asked me once what the hardest part of my journey had been, and I had answered honestly. The hardest part was learning how to say no, how to protect myself without feeling guilty about it. She had understood. Megan understood more than I gave her credit for. She was, in many ways, my greatest teacher. Tyler, on the other hand, was still struggling. His anger, his confusion, his refusal to accept what had happened between us, it weighed heavily on both of us. But I couldn't give up on him, not completely. I knew that, like me, he needed time to process, to come to terms with what he had done, with what had been done to him. The journey to reconciliation was long and slow, but it had begun. And for now that was enough. One evening, a few months after the settlement, I sat on the porch of my new cottage, the one I had purchased with the first substantial payment from Gregory. The sun was setting over the lake, casting a warm golden light across the water. I had chosen this place not just for its beauty, but for its quiet solitude. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could reflect on the life I had built and the journey I had taken to get here. I thought about the choices I had made, the boundaries I had set, the way I had refused to let the past define me. It hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been the hardest thing I had ever done. But in that moment, as I watched the water ripple and the sky change colors, I felt a deep sense of peace. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. I had done the work. And now, I was free to move forward. As I sat there, I thought about all that had come before. The betrayal, the heartache, the struggle. And I realized that, for all the pain, there had been something else that had emerged from it. Strength. Resilience. The ability to stand firm in the face of adversity and find my way back to myself. I had come through the fire, and though I would always carry the scars, I was no longer defined by them. Tomorrow, I would meet Megan for our weekly photography outing. We would walk along the shore, talking about everything and nothing. And for the first time in a long time, I would look ahead with hope, not just for my relationship with her but for the future I was building on my own terms. Time had begun to carve new patterns into my life, marking the passage of days with the kind of quiet certainty I hadn't known before. The chaos, the uncertainty, and the pain of the past had all left their mark on me, but I was no longer living in the shadow of that turmoil. I was finally beginning to feel like myself again, as though the storm had passed and I could breathe again. The lake cottage had become my haven, a place where I could leave behind the weight of the past and embrace the future in its own time. Each morning, I woke early, taking my time to watch the first rays of sunlight dance across the water. The world was full of beauty, of quiet moments of peace that spoke to my heart in ways I hadn't known were possible. The photography group I had joined continued to be an important part of my healing. As I clicked away at the world around me, capturing everything from the shifting light over the lake to the small details in the trees and wildflowers, I began to realize that my art was a reflection of the journey I had taken. Each photo was a snapshot of resilience, a moment of grace in the middle of turmoil. The more I captured, the more I understood that my life, much like my photography, was a series of moments, sometimes sharp, sometimes blurred, but always real. Megan, now 11, continued to be my biggest joy. Our bond had deepened over the months since the settlement, and we were often found on photo excursions, roaming the woods or sitting by the shore, talking about everything and nothing at all. Her insight, her wisdom beyond her years, reminded me that there was still hope, still love, still possibility even in the darkest moments. She had begun to take an interest in photography, and together we would spend hours learning the art of capturing the world. I often marveled at how much she had grown. There was an innocence in her eyes, yes, but also an understanding, a quiet wisdom that came from seeing the world for what it was, the good, the bad, and everything in between. She had asked me once, after an afternoon out with my camera, what the hardest part of my journey had been. I had answered her honestly. The hardest part was learning to stand up for myself, learning to say no when it was needed, and not feeling guilty about it. She had nodded, her expression serious, as if she had already understood that lesson. Tyler's journey, on the other hand, was far from resolved. Though I had tried to stay patient with him, to offer him the same grace that I had learned to give myself, I knew that it would take time. His anger and confusion had manifested in ways that were difficult to navigate. But I could see the flickers of the boy he had once been. When we spent time together, there were moments when he would laugh, when he would talk with more openness, and for brief seconds, I could see the warmth that had once been there. He was trying, I knew that. And so was I. The process of rebuilding trust was never a quick one, but it was starting to feel possible again. The first time he had truly apologized, without prompting, without guilt, just an honest expression of remorse, I had nearly cried. It wasn't the kind of apology I had hoped for or imagined, but it was a start. And in the complicated world we had all lived in, starts were enough. Gregory remained absent from my life, save for the occasional legal communication regarding settlement payments. He had sunk deeper into his isolation, clinging to the narrative that he was the victim in all of this. It was hard to imagine the person he had once been, the sensitive, perceptive boy who had cared for me as a mother should be cared for. Now, all I saw was a man unwilling to face the truth, unwilling to admit the harm he had done. Despite the bitterness I sometimes felt when I thought of him, I knew that I couldn't keep holding on to that anger. He had chosen his path, and it wasn't mine to fix. I had spent too many years giving parts of myself to others, sacrificing pieces of who I was for the sake of their comfort, their happiness, their needs. But I had learned, finally, that my life was mine to live, not theirs to dictate. Pam had been more present in my life than I had expected. It wasn't always easy, and we both knew that there were still unresolved issues between us, but she had made the brave choice to stand in her truth. She had chosen her own path, separate from Gregory, and that choice had required immense courage. Pam and I would meet for coffee sometimes. We'd talk about the children, about the struggles she faced as she navigated the fallout of her marriage, about the life she was slowly beginning to build without the constraints that Gregory had placed on her. I could see the difference in her now. She was more self-assured, more certain of who she was. She had found the courage to leave a toxic situation and, in doing so, had given herself the chance to rebuild her own life. That had been no easy decision. Sometimes, when we met, Pam would bring up the children. Her concern for Tyler was evident in the way she spoke about him, about his struggles to make sense of the situation. And she would speak of Megan with pride, how she had always been the sensitive one, the one who seemed to understand things on a deeper level. I couldn't help but agree. Megan had always been the one who could see through the layers, the one who could understand without needing to be told. There were still moments when I felt a pang of longing for the family I had once known, for the warmth and the connection that had once existed between us. But those moments were fewer now. I had started to see my life as it was, not as a collection of fractured relationships and broken dreams, but as a journey of growth and transformation. The settlement payments from Gregory, though substantial, were not the only compensation I had received. The real gift was in the way I had reclaimed my life, my voice, my choices. I had built a new world around me, one that was based on respect, on authenticity, on truth. And for the first time in a long time, I could look forward to the future without fear, without shame, without the weight of past mistakes defining me. There was still work to do. There were still wounds to heal. But I knew now that I had the strength to face them, to navigate the challenges of rebuilding relationships, of healing broken bonds. I would continue to show up for my grandchildren, for Pam, and even for Gregory, in whatever way was healthy and possible. And I would continue to show up for myself, taking every step forward with dignity, with courage, and with an open heart. Tomorrow, I would meet Megan again. And perhaps, one day, Tyler would join us, and together, we would find our way back to each other, one step at a time. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And that was enough. The days grew shorter as autumn settled into the lake cottage, and with it came the quiet rhythm of a life reshaped. It wasn't just the change in seasons that felt significant. It was the shift in how I saw the world, how I saw myself. I wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. I wasn't someone who had been silenced or diminished by others' choices. I was beginning to feel whole again, like the pieces of me, scattered for so long, were slowly coming back together. Judy remained my constant companion, the rock I had clung to through so much. Her visits were filled with laughter, quiet conversations, and shared routines. We had our favorite spots around the lake, the old bench by the weeping willow tree, the worn trail by the ridge where the leaves crunched underfoot. Those moments, simple and grounding, reminded me that even in the midst of turmoil, there was still beauty, still peace to be found. Megan's visits continued to be a highlight of my weeks. She had grown even more insightful in the months following our first real conversation, and her curiosity about life, about the world around her, was infectious. She loved to ask questions, to wonder aloud about the things she noticed, and I reveled in our discussions. I had never imagined that I would be the one to impart lessons on resilience, on finding strength in the face of adversity, but here I was. And I could see in her bright eyes the quiet understanding that she was absorbing those lessons, learning how to stand up for herself just as I had done. One afternoon, we spent hours together at the lake, skipping stones across the water, talking about school, about her dreams of traveling the world one day. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shoreline, she turned to me and asked, "Grandma, do you think things will ever be normal again?" It was a question I hadn't expected, but one I had asked myself countless times since everything had changed. I thought about it for a moment, watching the ripples in the water, the golden light reflecting off the surface. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "I think normal is something we create for ourselves. We may not be able to go back to what we had before, but that doesn't mean we can't build something new. Something better." Megan nodded, her face thoughtful. "I think you're right. You've taught me that we can't change the past, but we can choose what we do with what we've been given." I smiled at her, feeling a deep sense of pride. Exactly. And sometimes, that's the hardest lesson to learn, but also the most important. Tyler's journey remained more complex. The visits with him were strained at times, filled with silences and awkward exchanges. He had moments of warmth, but there was still a wall between us, one built on fear, guilt, and a deep sense of anger that he didn't know how to release. Pam had told me that he was still struggling with the truth of what had happened, torn between his loyalty to his father and the growing awareness that what Gregory had done was wrong. At times, I could see the boy he used to be, the one who would sit with me in the kitchen, asking me to tell him stories of when I was young, or who would make me laugh with his silly jokes. But those moments were fleeting. The walls that had been built between us were high, and neither of us knew how to scale them completely. Yet, there was hope. I refused to let go of that hope, even if it was buried beneath layers of confusion and resentment. Tyler was young, and the weight of what he had witnessed was heavy. He would come around, I believed. It would take time, but I had learned to be patient. Gregory, however, had become more and more of a distant figure in my life. The legal settlements, the occasional contact through his attorney, and his increasing detachment had shown me that his path was one he had chosen, one of denial, of refusing to face the truth. It was painful to see him like this, to see how much he had become entrenched in his own narrative. But as time went on, I began to realize that my healing wasn't dependent on his admission of guilt. His choices were his own, and they were no longer for me to carry. I had, in some ways, outgrown the need for closure with him. The closure I had found came not in his apology or his acknowledgement, but in my own decision to let go of the anger, to let go of the weight of his actions. I had freed myself in ways I hadn't thought possible, and as much as it hurt to know the truth about what had happened, I was learning to be at peace with the fact that I might never get the answers I wanted. The rest of the family, too, had begun to find their own paths. Howard and Nancy, who had once been so aligned with Gregory's narrative, had distanced themselves from him in ways that surprised me. They were, as Howard had put it, choosing truth over comfort. In their quiet way, they had supported Pam's decision to stand up to Gregory, and they had become a source of unexpected support for me. It wasn't the same as family, But it was a different kind of connection. One built on shared understanding and a willingness to acknowledge the truth, however difficult that truth might be. Pam, too, had continued to grow in ways I hadn't anticipated. Her decision to leave Gregory had been painful for her, but it had been a necessary one. She had found her footing again, both as a mother and as an individual. I could see the change in her, how much stronger she had become. We still didn't always agree, but we had found a mutual respect, and that was enough. For the sake of our grandchildren, we both wanted to move forward with compassion, with a sense of healing rather than blame. The court-ordered restitution payments from Gregory continued to arrive, as promised. Though they didn't fully restore what had been taken, they were a tangible sign that he was being held accountable, however reluctantly. More than that, they allowed me the freedom to continue rebuilding my life, to continue creating something new and lasting. I had found work at the local library, helping seniors learn how to navigate the digital world. It was rewarding, the kind of work that made me feel like I was giving back, connecting with others who had faced their own battles. I also continued my work with the photography group, finding new ways to express myself through my lens. The gallery show I had worked on earlier in the year had been a success, and I had been invited to submit more work for the next exhibition. My new life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It was a life built on my own terms, a life that I had reclaimed piece by piece, day by day. And with each passing day, I knew that I was becoming more of the woman I had always hoped to be, stronger, wiser, and at peace with the choices I had made. As winter approached, bringing with it the quiet stillness of the season, I found myself looking toward the future with a sense of calm anticipation. The challenges were far from over, but I had learned to face them with grace, with patience, and with a quiet determination to stay true to myself.